The worship of the god Apollo was one of the most popular in the Greek world. The oracles of Apollo were the prophecies the god handed down to believers. Apollo was the voice of Zeus, his father, and his oracles were therefore the will of the supreme god of Olympus. The worship of Apollo was a Greek rite, although a large number of foreigners also came in search of predictions. Even the Romans came to venerate this divinity, since there was a widespread belief in the oracles. The worship of Apollo reached its peak in Greece during the 4th century BC. Temples erected in honor of the god were everywhere. Three of the biggest and most important sanctuaries were the sanctuary on the island of Delos in the Cyclades, the one at Delphi in Phocis, and the one at Didymar near the city of Miletus in Ionia, present-day Turkey. Apart from being the god of prophecy, Apollo was also the god of light and the god of the arts, music in particular. Music competitions were often held at his sanctuaries. The sanctuary on the island of Delos became so important that it carved out a unique place in history. According to a 5th century BC Athenian edict, it was prohibited to be born or to die on this island. Yet Delos was not a desert island, for the city had many magnificent colonnaded streets, and judging from these remains, people used to produce, trade, and live there. So how was it possible that birth and death were banned in a place humming with such activity? When archaeologists started excavating on the nearby desert islet of Rhenia, they found a huge necropolis with thousands of bones and burial artifacts, and the answer to their question. It was there that the people of Delos buried their dead, and where its women gave birth. No one was allowed to be born or die on Delos, because the island was considered sacred, for it was here, according to legend, that Apollo was born. Not much of the temple to Apollo remains today, but when it was built, it measured 30 meters by 14 meters. It also had a monumental statue of the god in front that was 7 meters high, higher than the temple itself. Both peasants and rulers would come before Apollo to see what life had in store for them, a harvest or an imminent war. However, the god could not influence fate, which for the Greeks was already written and inevitable, even for Zeus. To pay homage to Apollo, the Delia, a festival which included athletic competitions and horse races, was held every 5 years all around the sanctuary. Music contests, including performances by numerous Greek singers, would have been part of this as well. Here one could take lessons from elderly musicians devoted to Apollo, learn to play the lyre or the metrics of verses. One could also learn how to compose melodies and adapt them to the rhythm of poetry. Even compete with the great winners of the Delian singing contests. In another part of the sanctuary, archaeologists found a concave floor bordered by a pavement and surrounded by the walls of an unusually long and narrow temple. When they unearthed this strange building, they called it the Temple of the Bulls, after the striking metapiece it contained. But its purpose was still a mystery. The concave shape of the floor and the length of the temple led scholars to believe the building had been erected to house a great trophy, a ship, or a 50-meter-long trireme. For a long time, Delos had been the center of the Delian League, a powerful naval alliance formed by the most important Greek cities. The Greek city-states had formed a league to defend its members from the Persian Empire, a powerful and menacing enemy they all feared. Since they wanted to minimize internal rivalries, they chose a neutral place as the seat of their alliance that could be a guarantor for all city-states, open to all Greeks at all times. The sacred island of Delos was just right. For a long time, the League's treasure was kept here. Delos was also renowned in ancient times for its thriving slave market and favorable trade position at the center of the main sea lanes. The tiniest of islands, known originally only for its divinity worship, Delos became a place of massive importance in the Western world. On the eastern side of the Aegean Sea, archaeologists excavating near the sanctuary at Didyma in Ionia, now modern-day Turkey, found the remains of two separate temples. The first was imposing and mostly still standing, while the second had only its foundations remaining and faced 30 degrees more towards the north than the first. Why was this? The first temple was erected much earlier, during the 6th century BC, and was later destroyed by the Persians in the war against the Greeks. Alexander the Great, king of Macedonia and the first king to be called the Great, reconquered the nearby city of Miletus and ordered the building of an enormous sanctuary in honor of Apollo. After the Temple of Artemis at Ephesus and the Heraion at Samos, the Temple of Apollo at Didyma is the third largest building ever erected in the Greek world. Its columns, whose imposing structure and decoration can still be appreciated to this day, were nearly 20 meters high and richly adorned. The colonnade that was erected at the top of the stairway had 3 entrances, 2 small ones on the sides, and a big one in the middle that was always open. Although it was the most inviting entrance, to actually use it was prohibited. Only priests could enter this room, called the vestibule. From here, the female prophets of Apollo would enter a trance and utter their incomprehensible responses that only the priests could translate. The rest of the crowd of worshippers could use either of the small side entrances to see the rest of the sanctuary. Both led to the same place. After walking through one of the small entrances, one would descend to the ground floor. At the end of a long corridor was the main area of the sanctuary of Didyma, a large laurel grove that grew out of the bare earth and contained a sacred spring. With no roof, the sanctuary was bathed in sunlight. In the background was a small temple, a naiskos that contained the statue of Apollo. Apollo made ambiguous predictions through a medium that was either a priest or a prophetess called an epithia. Responses were interpreted, and worshippers understood the oracle only after an event had occurred. In this way, the god never made a mistake. According to legend, after the temple of Didymus was rebuilt, the water of the sacred spring, which had dried up because of the plundering and burning by the Persians, started to flow again. The sacred spring and the laurel grove explained the unusual architecture of the impressive building that was mostly roofless and erected on 2 levels with 2 stairways, one to go up and the other to go down. Most of the visitors waited outside the temple, trying to make sense of the words that the priests had interpreted. Success is achieved only by those who wander around and are able to wait. Worshippers could set off on the sacred road with this knowledge, comforted by the fact that with Apollo's words they could not fail. The words encouraged and filled them with self-confidence. The sacred road that led to and from the sanctuary was lined with musicians inspired by the spiritual nature of the location, who played their lyres and recited poetry. Almost all singers in ancient times were poets, and most used the lyre to accompany their verses. This instrument was made from tortoise shell, which formed the resonant body. It had 2 horns and a crossbar on which cords were strung and plucked by a plectrum. In those days, musicians not only had to be good players, they had to be healthy and good-looking as well. It was even said that the great Homer was not allowed to take part in a singing contest because he was blind. It was on the Greek mainland where the most renowned center for prophecy in the ancient world was located, the sanctuary of Apollo at Delphi. In early digs, archaeologists excavating at deep layers found only votive statuary with female features. Shallower layers contained artifacts from a more recent period, mostly votive statuary, clearly with a male appearance. Why was there such a big difference? Once again, legend gave scholars the answer. It was said that Gaia, goddess of the earth, was venerated in an earlier period at Delphi, and that the serpent Python guarded her sanctuary. According to myth, Apollo grew tired of the small island of Delos where he was born, and roamed Greece in search of a suitable place to build a temple worthy of his stature. When he arrived at Delphi, he decided to erect his temple there, but had to take on the serpent Python that was also the guardian. Apollo slayed it with his arrows, which is why he's often referred to as Pythian. The votive statues of Gaia, antiquity of the earlier period, demonstrate the existence of a temple dedicated to her, while the votive statues of Apollo, found closer to the surface, indicate a change in worship that occurred in the later period. Apollo had settled at Delphi, supplanting Gaia, he started handing out oracles from his temple. But where and how did the god transmit his mysterious messages to worshippers? Archaeologists found an underground passage under this terrace that housed the temple of Apollo at Delphi. The tunnel led to a hollow with crevices in a rock. Scholars compared this discovery with ancient historical sources and discovered exactly how the rite was performed. After purifying themselves with water from the Castalian spring, Apollo's priestesses, the Pythians, descended into the basement cell. There they were surrounded by intoxicating fumes emanating from a crevice in a rock. Under the psychotropic effect of the fumes, the Pythians uttered mysterious words that the priests translated into oracles, either in prose or verse form. In ancient times, even the fate of a kingdom was entrusted to the oracles. A king might decide whether or not to attack, wage war, make peace, fight back, or surrender, based wholly on their predictions. By giving vague answers that could be interpreted in a number of ways, persuading people to act or wait, Apollo's priests also heavily influenced the politics of the time. Since they had power, they could also be bribed. To have a well-wishing oracle who could obtain consensus from the people, rulers and politicians did not mind paying the priests. Greeks believed in the inevitability of fate, and sometimes would ask the Delphic oracle for confirmation of a prophecy heard elsewhere. Knowing that through the priests Apollo could be less ambiguous and give more details about one's future, it was often prudent to make a generous offering so the priests would be more attentive. The oracle did not cure souls or prepare anyone for the afterlife, but simply handed out predictions that could be translated into real advantages in everyday life. The ancient sacred road that leads to the sanctuary is thronged today with tourists coming to see the archaeological site. But in ancient times, it was lined with statues and small temples. These were the treasures of Delphi that the 2nd century AD Greek writer Pausanias described with an abundance of detail. This treasure is the best preserved one, but there were many, all containing valuables and artworks, most of which were carried off over the centuries and never found again. Yet Delphi never fails to amaze. Gold, bronze and ivory votive objects and a magnificent sphinx, perhaps the city's most beautiful statue, have been unearthed. These superb objects, however, were not mentioned in Pausanias' meticulous book, Description of Greece. Scholars found the answer to this mystery by examining the disasters that occurred in the area, like earthquakes and the many landslides on the hills at Delphi. Had the gifts offered to Apollo been damaged in the disasters, they could no longer be displayed. Perhaps that's why people buried them as offerings inside the sanctuary. Another beautiful construction not mentioned by Pausanias is this tholos, a splendid circular building. The building had a diameter of approximately 9 meters and was 7 meters high. It wasn't very big, but with its 20 columns outside and 10 inside, it expressed the Greeks' tendency to seek formal perfection. The Tholos was an unusual building in classical Greece, and the one at Delphi stood at the top of its class. To worshippers, their images of the power and majesty of the gods was embodied in the beauty of this building. Besides being a place of worship, Delphi also played host to the Pythian Games, one of the 4 great athletic and artistic festivals of ancient Greece. Chariot races were one of the highlights of the festival, as represented by this bronze statue. Drama and music competitions were also held at the festival in this theatre situated beside the Temple of Apollo. Only those who have the courage to face the fiercest battles will receive the greatest rewards. The battles at the Pythian Games included wrestling, running and throwing. The event was held every 4 years between the Olympic Games. Winners were awarded crowns of laurel wreaths, the plant worn by Apollo himself, to whom the games were dedicated. Apollo was known for his wisdom and sense of justice. He was the patron of archery and bows and showed great courage even as a child. But he was also the patron of music and the arts and is often depicted with a lyre. According to myth, Zeus, the father of Apollo, released 2 eagles from opposite ends of the earth to discover the exact center of the world. They met at Delphi. To the Greeks, this was the heart of the earth, and Apollo was the brilliant god, the god of light and truth, the paragon of male beauty, who embodied all the values they held dear, who could guide them through their lives. And it was to Apollo that the Greeks entrusted their future.